The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents The Exodus. So imagine that you're on vacation in a foreign land with a friend who's pregnant. And you're arrested and you're thrown into jail and your friend goes into labor and you're screaming and pleading with the guards to, get her medical attention and help out, and nothing is happening, and there appear to be complications, and your friend is in pain and you're terribly worried. And in desperation, you hit your knees and you pray to a God and say, please, please, please help me. My friend here is in pain. She may be dying. There may be complications with the pregnancy. We need to get her to a hospital. I'm begging. This is in desperation. And a ball of light appears in front of your face. And it feels warm, and you are pacified, and you feel compelled to follow it. And as it moves away from you, the door to the jail cell opens up. And you and your friend are able to walk out of the jail. All of the guards are laying unconscious and completely removed from your path. You walk outside and there's a car parked directly in front of it that has its engine running, the keys are in it, the doors are open, the ball of light leads you over to this car, you get in and you begin to drive. You don't know the area, you have no idea where you're going, but you're following this ball of light. And as it takes you down the road, all of the cars on the road begin to move over to the side, just leaving you a clear, undisturbed path that takes you directly to the hospital. Is there anything that could ever happen, perhaps for the rest of your life, that would convince you that you hadn't just witnessed a miracle from God? Is there anything that would convince you that your prayers hadn't been answered? And given that this is the only God that purportedly exists, what would it take to make you worship another God or to disobey this God? It seems preposterous that you would ever just say, that's no big deal. This is, at least in part, the Exodus story as it's portrayed in the Bible. And there are a number of major problems with the way this story is portrayed. So before we get to the actual Exodus, we have to kind of backtrack a little bit. God has essentially called Moses to be his representative, and he wants him to challenge Pharaoh and demand that Pharaoh let his people go. The ancient Israelites are purportedly enslaved in Egypt. Now, we'll set aside the fact that archaeological studies can find no good evidence to support the idea that these two cultures ever coexisted, and it's not like shared words and languages. We can ignore some of the numbers that are presented in there, that during the Exodus there were over 600,000 men over the age of 20, which talks about a population of roughly 2 million people at a time when the entire population of Egypt was maybe 3 or 3.5 million people. I mean, this is not just a tiny group of people who are let out of here. It's been estimated that standing 10 abreast, they would stretch for 150 miles. And perhaps holding hands, they would stretch from where they were supposedly imprisoned all the way to where they eventually ended up. This is an incredibly large number of people. This is a non-trivial event, and yet there aren't recordings of it. The Egyptians don't seem to have noticed, just like they didn't seem to notice the flood. Setting aside the lack of archaeological evidence, the problem with the numbers, let's just look at the story. Now, people often complain that the aliens who supposedly come and abduct people tend to only pick people who aren't likely to be believed, people out in a rural area who don't have witnesses. And when we talk about religions, it's often a matter of a God choosing a specific individual to reveal information to, and then that person becomes the spokesperson for God. And in this case, the God of the ancient Israelites chooses Moses to free his people from this supposed slavery in Egypt. And Moses has a couple of objections, but one of the more significant ones, in my opinion, is that Moses says that he's slow of tongue, that he's not particularly eloquent. Now, we don't necessarily know if this actually meant he had a speech impediment. We don't even know if he existed, and we don't perhaps have good reason to assume that he did, given the nature of these stories. But he's not a very good speaker, and God says to him, hey, isn't Aaron over there, Aaron the Levite, your brother, he can speak, so what we'll do is I'll speak to you, and you speak to Aaron, and Aaron will speak on my behalf. Now, this seems to be yet another example of God picking one person to speak to, and that person is going to be the mouthpiece of God, only in this case, it's now a mouthpiece to a mouthpiece. You have to remember, God, in this context, is getting ready to provide some of the most awesome demonstrations of power ever. He's going to plague and ravage the nation of Egypt. He is going to lead his people out of Egypt, part the Red Sea so that there is walls of water and dry land for them to walk across, these 2 million people plus livestock. And they are led by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. They are fed manna from heaven. They are guided safely away. They watch the waves crash in to destroy any would-be pursuers. He's getting ready to really demonstrate some power. And yet, if Moses has a speech impediment, why would God choose Moses to be his spokesperson? And then when Moses complains, hey, I'm not a really good spokesperson, why doesn't God just, I don't know, perform a little miracle and fix Moses' speech problem? Instead, he has to pick somebody else to be the person who's doing the speaking. And if that's going to be the case, why doesn't God speak directly to Aaron? Why does he need to tell Moses, who's not very good at speaking, so that Moses can tell Aaron, who's better at speaking, so that Aaron can go off and tell Pharaoh? That seems preposterous at its face. Now, what happens is after the Israelites have witnessed all of these incredibly powerful demonstrations from this God, they are never represented in the Bible as actually speaking and acting as if that's what they saw. Instead, they refer to Moses who led us out of Egypt. And when Moses is gone for a period of 40 days or so, the Israelites immediately, it's Exodus beginning chapter 32, the people saw that Moses had not come back down from the mountain. He went up on a mountain, hasn't come back down. Now they go to Aaron and say, hey, why don't you make us a golden god that we can carry in front of us for the rest of our trip, because we don't know what's actually happened, with Moses. Now Aaron, who has been Moses' mouthpiece, God's kind of surrogate, doesn't seem to launch any objection or anything else. He just says, yeah, grab all your golden earrings from your wives, and I will make a golden calf, essentially. And the people worship it, and they may be attempting to worship the God that they think led them out of Egypt, but they've clearly made a mistake. Which means that if they're trying to worship the God that led them out of Egypt, and they don't understand they made a mistake, that this God has done an absolutely terrible job of communicating what he does and doesn't want from them. But the idea that they could have witnessed all of this and then just given up and said, oh, let's go worship some other God, or let's create a new representation of God, is absolutely preposterous if they had in fact witnessed and experienced the things that are recorded. But it's not preposterous when you realize that the ancient Israelites were a henotheistic group. This wasn't truly monotheism. They believed that there were many gods. The Bible supports this idea in its language. There are many times where God speaking or the gods speaking use the plural. Man has become like us, and people will say, oh, that's the royal we. But when you look at how the other gods are portrayed in the Bible, they're not portrayed as not real. They are portrayed as the gods of other nations. They are portrayed as the evil gods or the weaker gods. There were many gods, and Yahweh was the God of the Israelites. There's no reason to think that the ancient Israelites thought that they were worshiping the one and only God. Even in the Ten Commandments that Moses brings down, the first is, I am the Lord your God, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And before they even leave Egypt, while Aaron is being Moses' mouthpiece, and they're performing miracles, there's the issue of the sticks that turn into serpents. And what happens? Moses lays down his rod, or Aaron lays down the rod. I've actually forgotten who actually laid down the rod, but it turns into a snake. And the Pharaoh's like, that doesn't matter. All of my magicians can do that trick, from, they presumably getting power from their gods. They lay down their sticks and they turn into snakes. The portrayal isn't that they're worshiping false god and can't do magic. The portrayal is they're worshiping evil gods and they can do magic. It's not that the Yahweh God of the Israelites is the one and only God. He's just more powerful, which is why the snake from Moses and Aaron eats the other snakes. I have power over these other gods. And so the ancient Israelites were essentially henotheistic. They had these notions about other gods. So it's hardly surprising that after their escape, they're looking for a new god. In a world where you could potentially worship different gods, what have you done for me lately? Becomes an incredibly compelling argument, provided you haven't actually witnessed the miraculous events that are reported. If you had, it is, I think, unthinkable after witnessing these sorts of things that you could ever support or take up after another god or deny that you have witnessed an incredibly powerful being that is perhaps at least worthy of fear and reverence. So there's one more aspect to the Exodus story, and it all takes place in chapter 32. And I don't think I've actually bothered speaking about some of this before. And in part, it's because it isn't completely clear. Many passages in the Bible can seemingly be interpreted in many different ways, and so apologists will give a bunch of different explanations. I'm actually curious to see what interpretation some apologists put on some of the things that we're getting ready to cover. In chapter 32, Moses is gone. He's up on the mountain. He's been gone for a while. The people say to Aaron, hey, we don't know what's going on. We're going to make this golden calf. Aaron makes it. But while Moses is up on the mountain, God says to him, basically, hey, while you were up here, these people are turning away from me, turning away from what I've told them, and they've created this false god. And so God basically says, I need you to leave me alone, Moses, because I'm angry, I'm furious, and I am going to consume them. And Moses says to God, wait a minute, God, you're going to consume them. Why would you do that? You just spent all this time rescuing them from Egypt and displaying your power and might. What are the Egyptians going to say? They're going to sit back and laugh and say, yeah, look at it. Yeah, their God is awesome and powerful. He led them out of this land just so he could slaughter them out in the wilderness at the base of a mountain. You don't want that to happen. And after all, remember, you made promises to Abram and Isaac for all of Israel that you would multiply their seed and that you're going to give them this land. If you kill them all, you'll be going back on what you said. And Moses is evidently convincing, because in verse 14, it says, and the Lord repented of the evil which he thought to do unto his people. Now, there are some atheists who will say, the God was going to do evil. The thing to remember is that we're talking about the English of King James, and it doesn't mean that God was going to take an act that was evil. It was God was going to deliver this terrible, terrifying justice. These people deserve to be killed. So it would have been a good action based on their idea that God just can't do evil things. But from our perspective, it looks evil. So that's the language that we use for it. The interesting thing to me, though, is that God was going to kill them all, and Moses talked him out of it. Moses talked him out of it by saying, hey, you're going to look like an idiot, and you'd be breaking your promise. what kind of God didn't see all of this ahead of time? What kind of God thought that any of this was a good idea? The same type of God, I presume, who wants to plague a nation, who wants to harden the heart of Pharaoh so that he doesn't necessarily let the people go, so that God can keep showing off, who doesn't bother to fix Moses' speech impediment and comes up with a substitution. Of course, that kind of God would think it would be a good idea to just kill them all and start over. I mean, that's his track record. Hey, we're going to kick Adam and Eve out of the garden, and then later on we're going to flood the entire world, kill them all. We'll just start over with Noah in this. So here we have another example that God's just going to kill them all and, I guess, sort them out. But Moses talks him out of it. And then Moses goes down to the camp and sees what they've been doing. And Moses gets incredibly angry, tells the people how they've sinned against God. He took the calf that they made and burned it up in a fire and then ground it into powder and added it to the water and made them drink it. I mean, this is kind of a bizarre punishment. It doesn't even seem to make sense in the context of a lot of other things. But at least, we're not necessarily going to kill them. Or are we? Because what happens here is that Moses basically makes an appeal to God later in the chapter saying, hey, he tells the people, I'm going to go try to intercede on your behalf because God would like to kill you, even though we've already determined that God has repented of wanting to kill them. And he tells them all, consecrate yourselves to the Lord, and I'm going to go try to intercede on your behalf. And Moses goes back to God and says, hey, these people have sinned. They've made gods of gold, which kind of betrays the idea that they were just trying to make an effigy of Yahweh that happened to look like a calf when you start talking about gods of gold. But he says to God in verse 32, if you'll forgive their sins, and if not, then blot me, I pray, out of the book that you've written. And the Lord says to Moses in verse 33, whoever hath sinned against me, him will I blot out of my book. Now, there are people who think that this means that God is willing to forgive the sins on behalf of Moses. I'm not necessarily sure that that is an accurate interpretation. It seems to me that Moses is saying, let me intercede and blot me out of the book that you've written. We may be talking about the book of life and, basically kill me and keep your promise to them. And God says, whoever has sinned against me, I'm going to blot them out. So after repenting of his desire to go down and consume them and kick their butts, Moses comes back to intercede, and God says, no, I'm going to make them pay. So after repenting of doing it, he's now going to do it. So he sets an angel to lead them, and in verse 35, he plagued the people because they made the calf. And then earlier, Moses had already basically said, those of you who are with the Lord, come over here to me, and we're going to slaughter the rest of you, and kill the, 3,000 people or something like that. So there's all this slaughter going on. You have here a God that only communicates with a single individual, doesn't seem to be particularly rational, doesn't seem to be particularly loving. All of this story, from the creation of other gods to the immediate, what have you done for me lately, to the plagues and the destruction, oh, please God, don't kill us. No, I'm going to kill you all. None of you are going to see the land of Canaan, but your descendants will, so that I'll be able to keep my promise. You won't get there, but somebody else will, and that's my loophole. This all reads more as a narrative of people who are trying to create and embellish a history that doesn't seem to have any ties to reality, or very tenuous ties to reality at best. And talking about how they have their God. They are the chosen people of their God. And even after he had done good things for them, they disobeyed him, and that's why they suffered. The entire story of the ancient Israelites is one of them constantly failing their God. But when they write about it, the God that they portray seems incredibly fallible and human and distant and reachable only through individual messengers, individual prophets, the chosen individuals who are allowed to go into the Holy of the Holies. If it were God and you chose some people to be your chosen people, to be your special tribe, why wouldn't you talk to them? Why would their understanding of you be so confused? Why would Abraham have the idea that you're willing to accept child sacrifice? Why would you pick a drunk like Noah to be the progenitor of an entire group of chosen people? Why would you pick a person who can't speak very well to be your spokesperson? Why would you go through all this rigmarole of constantly hiding yourself, and yet somehow you're also going to display your incredible power by visiting plagues and destruction on the land? Oh, this time I want to kill you. This time I want to kill everybody. This time I'm not going to kill everybody right away. I'm going to kill you off slowly with plagues so that only your descendants will get the promise. This is all about Jewish angst at how their God doesn't seem to be working in their best interest, and they continually take the blame upon themselves. It's a preposterous set of tales that seem at their face to be, wow, so much bad stuff has happened to us. How can we possibly be the chosen people? It's because we've done wrong. Despite the fact that we have absolutely no good reason to think that this God exists at all. And the people don't act as if they have actually witnessed the power of a God. And that makes the entire story just absurd.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.